my cheating wife with a criminal who endangered our kids, so I let her world collapse silently. I don't lose sleep over what happened. I lose sleep over when it started. My name is James, and I'm 61 years old. I'm a construction engineer who has spent the last 3 decades working 14-hour days, pouring concrete and steel into foundations, believing I was building something permanent. I thought I understood the meaning of solid ground until I discovered that my own life had been built on quicksand for 30 years. Quincy is 59 now, my wife of 35 years, and for most of our marriage, I saw her as the embodiment of everything a man could want in a partner. She was intelligent, gentle, nurturing, the kind of woman who could make a house feel like a home just by being in it. We have 2 sons, both grown men now, and I had always believed we were the perfect family. Every morning when I left for work, I kissed Quincy goodbye thinking I was living the American dream. Every evening when I returned, exhausted from managing construction sites and dealing with contractors, she would greet me with that warm smile that seemed to wash away all the stress and frustration of the day. Our life had a rhythm that felt natural and comfortable. I would work my long hours, sometimes starting before dawn and not returning until well after sunset, but it never felt like a burden because I knew I was providing for people I loved. Quincy managed our household with the kind of effortless grace that made everything look easy. She packed my lunch every morning, remembered every important anniversary and birthday, attended every school event for our boys, and created the kind of warm, loving atmosphere that made our house the place where all the neighborhood kids wanted to spend their time. I trusted her completely and without reservation. In 35 years of marriage, it never once crossed my mind that she might be living a secret life. When she told me she was taking the boys to visit friends, I believed her without question. When she seemed to have an active social life that kept her busy during my long work days, I was proud of her for maintaining friendships and staying engaged with the community. When she occasionally seemed distant or preoccupied, I assumed it was just the natural ebb and flow of a long marriage, the kind of temporary disconnection that happens to all couples from time to time. Looking back now, I realize how completely I had bought into the illusion she had created. I saw what I wanted to see, believed what I needed to believe to maintain my sense of security and happiness. I was so focused on being the reliable provider, the steady husband, the man who would never let his family down, that I never questioned the foundation of trust that our entire relationship was supposedly built on. I worked those 14-hour days, not just because I had to, but because I believed I was building something lasting and meaningful for the people I loved most in the world. The first hairline crack in my perfect world appeared about 8 months ago, though I didn't recognize it as such at the time. I started noticing that Quincy was taking the boys out more frequently than usual. Just going to see a friend, she would say, or the boys want to visit Uncle Nick. The name Nick had started appearing in our family conversations more often, usually in casual references that our sons would make about their afternoon activities. Uncle Nick showed us his workshop today, or Uncle Nick made us lunch, or Uncle Nick taught us how to fix the bicycle. At first, I thought it was wonderful that Quincy had maintained such close friendships, that her friends had become like family to our children. I was proud of her for being so social and for raising boys who were comfortable with adults and could form meaningful relationships with people outside our immediate family. But as the weeks went by, I began to notice small things that didn't quite add up. Quincy would return from these visits with a particular kind of glow, a happiness that seemed different from her usual contentment. She would be humming while she did the dishes, or I would catch her staring out the window with a faraway look in her eyes, as if she was remembering something pleasant that had happened earlier in the day. When I asked about Nick, Quincy's responses were always vague and slightly evasive. She would describe him as an old friend, someone who had been kind to our family, a person who enjoyed spending time with children. But she never offered to introduce me to him, never suggested that we invite him over for dinner, never included him in any of our family gatherings or social events. The more I thought about it, the more unusual this seemed. If Nick was such a good friend, such an important part of our boys' lives, why had I never met him? Why did Quincy seem to tense up slightly whenever I asked direct questions about him? I began paying closer attention to the patterns of these visits. They happened roughly twice a week, always during my work hours, and they typically lasted 3 to 4 hours. Quincy would dress more carefully on these days, taking a little extra time with her hair and makeup in a way that seemed unnecessary for a casual visit with a friend. She would pack snacks for the boys and sometimes bring along small gifts or homemade treats, as if she was going to visit family rather than just a neighborhood acquaintance. The boys' stories about Uncle Nick became more detailed and more frequent. They talked about his house, his garden, his cooking, his tools, his books. They described him with the kind of easy familiarity that comes from spending significant amounts of time with someone, not the polite friendliness that children usually show toward their parents' casual acquaintances. It was clear that Uncle Nick wasn't just someone they visited occasionally. He was someone who had become a regular and important presence in their lives. One afternoon, I decided to come home early from work, thinking I might surprise Quincy and maybe finally meet this mysterious Nick if they were visiting. But when I arrived at our house, I found it empty. According to the neighbor, Quincy had left with the boys around noon, saying they were going to visit a friend. I sat in our living room, surrounded by the comfortable furniture and family photos that represented 35 years of shared life, and felt the first real stab of suspicion pierce through my contentment. That evening, when Quincy and the boys returned, I asked casually about their afternoon. The boys chattered excitedly about Uncle Nick's new project in his workshop, about the sandwiches he had made for lunch, about the games they had played in his backyard. Quincy listened to their stories with a smile that seemed both genuine and nervous, occasionally adding small details or correcting minor facts in their recounting. But when I asked more specific questions about Nick, what kind of work he did, how long they had known him, whether I might meet him sometime, her answers became vague and evasive again. Over the next several weeks, I found myself becoming increasingly preoccupied with the mystery of Uncle Nick. I started paying closer attention to Quincy's behavior, looking for clues that might help me understand what was really going on. I noticed that she had started guarding her phone more carefully, taking it with her when she went to the bathroom or into the kitchen, and I occasionally heard her having quiet conversations that she would end quickly when I entered the room. She claimed these calls were from her sister or from friends, but something about her body language suggested that wasn't entirely true. The breakthrough came when I made a decision that felt like a betrayal of everything I believed about trust and marriage. I followed them. I took a sick day from work and waited until Quincy and the boys left for one of their visits to Uncle Nick. Then I got in my car and followed them at a distance. I felt terrible about it, like I was violating something sacred between us, but I had to know the truth. The uncertainty was eating away at me, making me question everything I thought I knew about my life and my family. They drove to a modest neighborhood about 20 minutes from our house, to a small single-story home with a well-maintained yard and flower gardens. I parked several houses away and watched as Quincy and the boys walked up to the front door. Before they could even knock, the door opened, and a man stepped out to greet them. The way he embraced Quincy made my blood freeze in my veins. It wasn't the polite hug of a friend or the casual greeting of a neighbor. It was the intimate, comfortable embrace of lovers who had been apart and were happy to be reunited. I sat in my car for nearly 4 hours, watching my wife and children play house with another man. Through the windows, I could see them eating lunch together, sitting around a table like a family. I watched Quincy laugh in a way she hadn't laughed with me in years, saw her touch this man's arm with casual affection, witnessed the easy domesticity that should have belonged to our marriage. The boys moved through Nick's house with the kind of comfortable familiarity that comes from regular visits, knowing where things were kept, helping with simple tasks, treating the space like a second home. It was like watching an alternate version of my life, one where I had been completely erased and replaced. Everything about the scene suggested long-term intimacy and established routine. This wasn't a new friendship or a recent development. This was a relationship that had clearly been going on for a significant period of time. The way Quincy moved through Nick's house, the way she anticipated his needs and he anticipated hers, the way our children interacted with him as if he was a beloved uncle or family friend. All of it spoke to years of shared time and accumulated memories. When I finally found the emotional strength to do some research, I discovered the most shocking truth of all. Nick wasn't just any man. He was my former brother-in-law, Quincy's sister's ex-husband, someone who had been permanently banished from our family circle more than 30 years ago. He had been accused of inappropriate sexual behavior with children, and our entire extended family had agreed to cut all contact with him. We had specifically agreed that he should never be around our children, never be part of our lives again, never be welcome at family gatherings or events. The realization hit me like a physical blow to the chest. Quincy hadn't just been having an affair. She had been deliberately exposing our children to someone we had collectively identified as a potential danger to them. She had been lying not just about infidelity, but about the fundamental safety and well-being of our family. The betrayal was so complete, so devastating in its scope and implications, that I couldn't process it all at once. I had to sit with the knowledge for days, letting it settle into my consciousness piece by piece, before I could even begin to understand what it meant for our marriage and our family. For 30 years, the entire time our children had been growing up, Quincy had been maintaining a secret relationship with Nick. While I was working 14-hour days to provide for our family's future, she was building an alternate family structure with a man who had been explicitly banned from our lives for the safety of our children. She had been taking our sons to visit him regularly, creating memories and relationships and emotional bonds that I knew nothing about. She had been lying to me every single day for 3 decades, and she had been doing it with such skill and consistency that I had never suspected anything was wrong. The scope and duration of the deception was breathtaking in its audacity. This wasn't a moment of weakness that had spiraled out of control, or a brief affair that had become complicated. This was a deliberate, systematic betrayal that had been maintained with incredible planning and discipline for literally decades. Every anniversary celebration, every family vacation, every intimate conversation, every declaration of love, all of it had been contaminated by this massive, ongoing lie that sat at the center of our marriage like a cancer. I began to understand that Quincy had been living 2 completely separate lives with remarkable skill and dedication. During the day while I was at work, she was Nick's partner, sharing domestic intimacy and parental responsibilities in his home. In the evenings and on weekends, when I was present, she was my devoted wife, maintaining the facade of our marriage with what I now realized was consummate acting ability. She had been compartmentalizing so completely that she could switch between these 2 roles seamlessly, never letting the emotions or obligations of one relationship contaminate the other. The children's easy familiarity with Nick suddenly made perfect sense. They had been visiting him regularly since they were very young, probably since toddlerhood. To them, he wasn't a stranger or even a friend of the family. He was Uncle Nick, someone who had been a consistent presence in their lives for as long as they could remember. Quincy had normalized the relationship so completely that our sons saw nothing unusual or secretive about it. They had been living in 2 different family systems simultaneously, and they didn't even realize there was any conflict or deception involved. As I pieced together the timeline, I realized that Quincy's affair with Nick had begun around the time she was pregnant with our second son. She had been carrying my child while rekindling her relationship with a man who had been banned from our family for his inappropriate behavior with children. The pregnancy had provided perfect cover for any changes in her behavior or emotional state, and the new baby had given her an excuse to be out of the house more frequently for pediatric appointments and playgroups that were actually visits to Nick's home. The strategic brilliance of her deception was almost admirable in its thoroughness. By maintaining both relationships openly, her marriage to me and her affair with Nick, she had created a situation where she could have everything she wanted without having to make any difficult choices. She had financial security, social respectability, and the stability of a long-term marriage with me. At the same time, she had passion, excitement, and emotional fulfillment with Nick. She had been living the best of both worlds while I lived in complete ignorance of the true nature of our relationship. The most psychologically devastating aspect of the situation was realizing that she had been using our children as both cover and justification for the affair. Taking the boys to visit Nick made the relationship seem innocent and family-friendly, providing perfect camouflage for regular intimate contact. At the same time, I suspected that she had convinced herself that she was doing something good for our children by maintaining their relationship with Nick, perhaps telling herself that he was lonely and deserved to have family in his life despite his past mistakes. But the truth was much darker and more selfish. She had been prioritizing her own emotional and physical needs over the safety and well-being of our children. She had been willing to risk their exposure to someone with a documented history of inappropriate behavior because maintaining that exposure was necessary for maintaining her affair. Every time she took our sons to Nick's house, she was gambling with their safety for the sake of her own gratification. I spent weeks in a state of emotional shock, going through the motions of our daily routine while my mind raced with questions and realizations. How had she managed to compartmentalize so completely for so long? How had she looked me in the eye every day for 30 years while maintaining such an elaborate deception? What kind of person was capable of sustaining that level of dishonesty and manipulation? Had anything about our marriage been real, or had it all been an elaborate performance designed to provide her with cover for her true priorities? The confrontation, when it finally happened, was not what I had expected. I had imagined anger, drama, shouting matches, and ultimatums. Instead, it was quiet and sad and somehow inevitable. I simply told Quincy that I knew about Nick, that I had known for several weeks, and that I needed her to tell me the truth about how long it had been going on and what it meant for our marriage. She cried, of course, but they were tears of relief as much as regret. The burden of maintaining such an elaborate lie for so long had been exhausting, and part of her seemed genuinely relieved to finally let it go. She told me that the affair had been going on for 30 years, that it had started when she was pregnant with our second son, and that she had tried many times to end it, but had never been able to bring herself to do it. She explained that she loved both of us, that she had never wanted to hurt anyone, but that she also couldn't bear to abandon Nick when he had no one else in his life. She painted herself as someone who had been trapped by her own compassion and loyalty, someone who had been unable to choose between 2 people she cared about deeply. She claimed that she had always intended to end the affair eventually, but that there had never seemed to be a right time to do it. She said that she had been planning to tell me everything when we got older, when the children were completely independent, when she felt like the timing was better for everyone involved. But I could see through her self-serving explanations to the fundamental selfishness that had driven 30 years of deception. She hadn't been trapped by compassion, she had been empowered by greed and entitlement. She had wanted everything and had been willing to lie and manipulate to get it. She had been willing to risk our children's safety, our family's stability, and my emotional well-being to maintain her double life. The tears and apologies were real, but they came from a place of self-pity and fear of consequences, rather than genuine remorse for the harm she had caused. The most devastating part of her confession was learning that she had never actually planned to choose between us. She had been perfectly content to maintain the status quo indefinitely, letting me live in ignorance while she enjoyed the benefits of both relationships for the rest of our lives. The only reason she was confessing now was because she had been caught, not because she had developed a conscience or decided that honesty was more important than convenience. I told Quincy that I would be moving out of our house, that I needed time and space to process what I had learned and decide what I wanted to do next. I didn't shout or make threats or demand immediate answers to impossible questions. I simply explained that I couldn't continue to live in a space where every memory had been contaminated by lies, where every shared moment had been tainted by the knowledge of her betrayal. The look of panic on her face when I announced my intention to leave was immediate and unmistakable. She suddenly realized that her carefully constructed world was about to collapse entirely. Nick had been willing to be her secret lover for 30 years, but he had never signed up to be her public partner. He had spent 3 decades in the shadows, content to be her hidden companion, but he wasn't prepared to step into the light and become her acknowledged relationship. I moved in with our older son, who had been absolutely devastated to learn about his mother's 30-year affair. He had always looked up to Quincy as an example of integrity and devotion, and the revelation that she had been systematically lying to all of us for his entire life was psychologically crushing for him. Our younger son was more confused than angry initially, struggling to understand how the mother he loved and respected could have done something so fundamentally dishonest and hurtful to the father he admired. Both boys were forced to confront the fact that many of their happiest childhood memories had been built on a foundation of deception. All those pleasant afternoons with Uncle Nick, all those special treats and fun activities, all those feelings of being loved and cared for by an extended family member, all of it had been part of their mother's elaborate cover story for an affair. They had to recontextualize their entire childhood experience through the lens of their mother's betrayal. The aftermath unfolded exactly as I had predicted it would. Nick, faced with the prospect of having to choose between his comfortable secret affair and a public relationship with Quincy, chose to retreat into solitude. He had never wanted to be her full-time partner or to take responsibility for her happiness and well-being. He had wanted to be her escape from reality, her secret adventure, her hidden passion. When the secrecy was stripped away and the relationship was exposed to daylight, it lost all its appeal for him within a month of my moving out. Nick had ended his relationship with Quincy completely. He told her that he wasn't interested in a public relationship, that he had never intended for their affair to become a real partnership, and that he preferred to return to his previous life of solitude, rather than deal with the complications and responsibilities that would come with being her acknowledged boyfriend. 30 years of secret love ended with a brief conversation and a closed door. Quincy found herself exactly where she had always feared she would end up, completely alone, without the security of our marriage or the excitement of her affair. She had gambled everything on her ability to maintain both relationships indefinitely, and she had lost both of them in the space of a few weeks. The woman who had once seemed to have everything, a devoted husband, loving children, and a passionate secret love, now had nothing but an empty house and a crushing weight of regret. The house where we had raised our children became a monument to her deception. Every room held reminders of the lies she had told and the life she had pretended to live. She wandered through it like a ghost, haunted by the choices she had made and the consequences she had never allowed herself to seriously consider. The neighbors who had once admired her as the perfect wife and mother now whispered about her behind her back, and she became a cautionary tale about the dangers of trying to have everything without paying any price. I found peace in my new life much more quickly than I had expected. Living with my son, I was surrounded by authentic relationships based on honesty and mutual respect. There were no secrets, no hidden agendas, no carefully constructed facades to maintain. We talked openly about what had happened, about how we felt, about what we wanted for the future. It was the kind of genuine intimacy I had thought I had with Quincy, but now I understood the difference between real connection and performed connection. My work took on new meaning and satisfaction. I was no longer laboring 14 hours a day to support someone else's elaborate fantasy. I was working for myself, for my own future, for my own sense of purpose and accomplishment. The buildings I constructed felt more solid and meaningful because they were built on genuine foundations rather than elaborate deceptions. I took pride in creating things that would last, things that were exactly what they appeared to be. The boys gradually adapted to the new reality of our family situation. They still loved their mother, but they also learned to separate their feelings for her from their judgment of her actions. They maintained a relationship with Quincy, but it was different now, more cautious, more conditional, more honest about what she was capable of. They had learned one of life's most difficult lessons, that love doesn't require acceptance of unacceptable behavior, and that forgiveness doesn't mean pretending that harmful actions didn't have consequences. Quincy made numerous attempts to reconcile over the following months. She promised that she had ended things with Nick permanently, that she was ready to be the wife I deserved, that she would do whatever it took to earn back my trust and rebuild our marriage. She suggested counseling, therapy, a trial separation followed by a gradual reunion. She offered to move away from our current city, to start fresh somewhere new where the memories wouldn't be so painful. But her promises felt hollow and meaningless because I now knew that she was capable of saying anything to get what she wanted. She had been making promises to me for 30 years while simultaneously and systematically breaking them. Her words no longer had any weight or credibility, and I couldn't imagine any scenario in which I would ever be able to trust her again. The foundation of faith that any marriage requires had been completely destroyed, and there was no way to rebuild it. The divorce proceedings were surprisingly straightforward and amicable. Quincy didn't contest anything, perhaps because she understood that she had no moral or legal ground to stand on. She accepted a settlement that left her with enough money to live comfortably, but not enough to maintain the lifestyle she had enjoyed as my wife. She would have to learn to live with reduced circumstances, just as she was learning to live with the social consequences of her choices. The community's reaction was mixed but generally sympathetic to my situation. Most people were shocked by the duration and scope of Quincy's deception, and they understood that I had been the victim of an extraordinarily elaborate and long-term betrayal. Some people were more judgmental, suggesting that I should have known what was happening, that I should have been more attentive to my wife's emotional needs, that I bore some responsibility for her decision to seek fulfillment elsewhere. But their opinions didn't matter to me anymore. I had learned to trust my own judgment and to rely on my own sense of what was right and wrong. The most difficult part of the entire process was grieving for the dreams and expectations I had built around our marriage. I had imagined growing old with Quincy, celebrating our 50th wedding anniversary, watching our grandchildren grow up, sharing the comfortable intimacy that comes with a lifetime of shared experiences. I had to mourn not just for what I had lost, but for what I had never really had in the first place. The marriage I thought I had been living had been a fiction, but the love and commitment I had felt for it had been completely real. As I write this, it has been more than a year since I moved out of the house where I thought I had been building a life with my soulmate. Quincy still lives there alone, still hoping that either Nick will change his mind and choose her, or that I will eventually forgive her and agree to come home. But both of those possibilities require her to face a reality she has spent her entire adult life avoiding, that actions have consequences, that lies have costs, that some betrayals are too fundamental and too extensive to overcome. The boys and I have created new traditions and built new memories based on honesty and mutual respect. We talk about their mother sometimes, but without bitterness or anger. We discuss her with sadness, as someone who made choices that ultimately hurt everyone she claimed to love. We hope she finds peace and learns from her mistakes, but we're not waiting for her to change or for her to develop the character she never possessed. We're building our own future, one that doesn't depend on anyone else's promises or performances. I've learned that it's possible to love someone deeply and still refuse to accept their behavior. I've learned that trust, once broken on such a fundamental level, cannot be rebuilt through promises and tears and good intentions. I've learned that sometimes the kindest and most respectful thing you can do for someone is to let them face the full consequences of their actions, even when those consequences are painful and permanent. I've also learned that I'm much stronger and more resilient than I ever imagined I could be. I survived 30 years of systematic deception without even knowing I was surviving it, and I'm thriving in the aftermath of its revelation. I'm building a new life based on truth rather than illusion, on authenticity rather than performance, on dignity rather than desperation. It's not the life I had planned or expected, but it's a life I can respect and take pride in. I was once the victim of a woman who believed she could live two lives simultaneously, who thought she could maintain elaborate deceptions indefinitely, who convinced herself that she could have everything she wanted without paying any meaningful price. Today, I'm a man who has learned to value honesty over harmony, truth over comfort, integrity over convenience. I'm a man who has survived the complete destruction of everything he thought he knew about his life, and who has discovered that recovery is not only possible, but can lead to a deeper and more authentic happiness than he had ever experienced before. The woman who spent 30 years lying to me every single day is still alone in the house where we raised our children together, still waiting for someone to rescue her from the consequences of her choices. But rescue isn't coming from Nick, who has moved on to his preferred life of solitude, and it isn't coming from me, who has found peace in a life built on truth rather than fantasy. She made her choices deliberately and consistently for 3 decades, and now she has to live with the results of those choices. I made my choice too, and I'm learning every day to live with it proudly and peacefully. The difference is that my choice was based on reality and self-respect, while hers was based on selfishness and deception. In the end, I've discovered that truth is the only foundation strong enough and reliable enough to build a real life on, and that dignity is worth more than any relationship that requires you to sacrifice it. I was once a man who worked 14 hours a day for 30 years to support a family that existed only in his imagination. Today, I'm a man who has learned that the most important work anyone can do is the work of building an honest life, and that sometimes the greatest act of love is refusing to enable someone else's destructive choices. I'm free now in ways I never knew I wanted to be, and I'm grateful every day for the strength I found to choose truth over comfortable lies, even when the truth was more painful than I ever could have imagined.